in the US, dealing with the global issues in nanotechnology, and responsible for this chair at the US Department of State. And Chris will tell us about, let's say, the current and future EU-US cooperation in nanomedicines. What are the routes for a fair trade? Chris, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you, Patrick, for that introduction, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to join you all here in Switzerland. I'm glad to be back after spending many years in Lausanne, where I did my PhD studies at the EPFL. So yes, my name is Chris Cannizzaro. I work at the U.S. Department of State on international issues as they pertain to advanced technologies and emerging technologies such as nanotechnology. For the Department of State within the United States would be like a foreign ministry, but we also have a bit of a broader mandate. And as you'll see later, our jobs is to try to coordinate science and technology activities internationally, since we don't have one Ministry of Science and Technology, but we have multiple agencies. I will just give you a brief overview of nanotechnology policy in the U.S. as an overarching framework. Some examples of how and where the U.S. government is engaged internationally, such as in forums such as the Transatlantic Economic Council, the TEC, a little bit about what we're doing in the TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Innovation Partnership, and then finish with a specific example where at least I'm most directly engaged, and that's the US-EU Nano-EHS dialogue. So the U.S. National Nanotechnology Initiative was actually launched by President Clinton in the year 2000, but it dates back even a little bit earlier in the United States. And it has actually survived and even flourished in the successive administrations, which these days, and it enjoys bilateral support from both the Republicans and the Democrats, so that's something a little bit rare these days in Washington. It was established, actually there's a law which created it, and it was signed into the law by President Bush in 2003, and it's the 21st Century Nanotechnology Research and Development Act. And it was quite a forward-looking document in that, as part of it, it didn't specifically call for technology transfer, and that the agencies would try to translate this large increases in funding to benefit society, and I think that's particularly relevant to what we're talking about here with clinical medicine. So as I mentioned, the National Nanotechnology Initiative brings together 20 top-level federal agencies within the United States government, 11 of which have funding, and it has top-level oversight by the White House's Office of Science and Technology Policy and the White House Office of Management and Budget. And of course, represented there would be NIH, FDA, which would be most directly relevant to the discussions here today. Just to let you know, as mandated by the law, just this year we released an updated strategic plan for the NNI, and it has retained the 4 goals that the NNI has had since the beginning. That's to advance world-class research and development, transfer this R&D to products for commercial and public benefit, to educate and retain a skilled workforce, and to do this in a responsible and sustainable manner. And so that's getting into trying to educate the public about some of the ELSI issues that we just heard about. So these documents are all available on the website maintained by the Coordination Office, the National Nanotechnology Coordination Office, and I just pulled that down the other day, and you can see that they're featuring a nanomedicine device, and and they do that, those kind of scroll through. And you can see one other document I just wanted to point you to is the 2015 NNI supplement to the President's budget. And I'll just note that because, well, notably the cover has gold shell nanoparticles, which were characterized at the NCL, and provided by, I assume you provided the artwork for this, so they usually rotates among the agencies. But you can find out what the agencies are doing in nanomedicine and beyond, as well as what the each of the agencies are funding in the United States. And probably most importantly, you can find out contact information for the individuals from each of the agencies who attend these meetings. As well as a nice map, you can find out all the infrastructure in the United States, including the NCL. So because nanotechnology, we have the science part, but a number of trade issues have arisen and a number of regulatory issues. The White House set up a specific committee that would bring these communities together. It's the Emerging Technologies Interagency Policy Coordination Committee, the ETIPC. And it's chaired by 3 offices in our White House. So it's the Office of Science and Technology Policy, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, OMB-OIRA, which oversee all regulatory activities in the United States, and the Office of the United States Trade Representative. That in June of 2011, they released a memo which provides high-level guidance to the U.S. Agencies on the regulation and oversight of nanotechnology and nanomaterials. This is a public document that you can download it there. But one of the most key points in this is, well, the first quote, and essentially what it says is the U.S. agencies their guidance to them is to treat nanomaterials on a case-by-case basis. And this is the position that the European Commission took in their second regulatory review last year, and also the position of the OECD Council in late of 2013. Also, as part of that document, it calls for the federal government to coordinate internationally on research, to communicate the regulatory approaches we're taking, to share relevant data, and also to participate in international standards. So this is actually a lot of the stuff that the NCL does, and cooperating with an EU NCL would definitely fall within this area. Something that I'm very much involved in is the OECD, particularly the OECD Working Party on Nanotechnology, which, again, and as the theme in our prior talk we heard about convergence, will now be starting in 2015, the Working Party on biotechnology, nanotechnology, and converging technologies, to specifically address the issues that are the convergence issue that are arising. This is a slide from a workshop we hosted in Washington in 2012. It's very important that we demonstrate to the public the large investments that we're making in nanotechnology to try to quantify those metrics, and probably even more importantly, to demonstrate the value of this work to the United States, to the Congress, such that we continue to get funding for the work with, I think everyone here is a believer, but we have to do a good job of conveying that, and also trying to quantify it, even though it's difficult to quantify something that you may not see the value for 10, 15, 20 years down the road. And so this report is available. We had a breakout session on nanomedicine there as well, as one of the sectors. In terms of international regulatory cooperation, we have 3 high-level dialogues. One of them is with the EU, and I'll talk a bit more about that. That would be under the Transatlantic Economic Council. So starting, this was at the cabinet level, and in 2011, the TEC issued a statement welcoming the US and the EU to cooperate, specifically on regulatory, scientific, and legislative issues. There's a list of things that we're supposed to talk about. There's strong support to do this. We do meet regularly, at least twice per year, with between the United States, the Emerging Tech IPC, which I mentioned earlier, and the European Commission's Inter-Service Group for Nanotechnology. And we discuss things such as definitions for nanotechnology, new regulations that either the US or the Commission are looking to put forward, as well as science and technology cooperation to address particular issues. In fact, this is just a slide I captured for a workshop the EU held on when they released their second regulatory review, and you can see that they highlighted our cooperation, the US-EU communities of research, which we've set up, particularly to address nanotechnology, environmental health and safety issues, which in many ways parallel the work of nanomedicine. So these were established at a workshop we held in Washington in 2011, and since then we've held 3 workshops, and we have a 4th workshop planned. What we're trying to do here is look at the US and EU nano-EHS research priorities with the high-level NNI document as our strategy, and then the Nanosafety in Europe research report, which was released last year. And if you compare the core categories in the US document with the common nanosafety research themes in the Commission document, you can see that even though the wording is slightly different, we're basically trying to address the same questions on the safety side. But again, a lot of this work translates to what the nanomedicine field. We have what we call cores, communities of research, with six cores, and there are co-chairs for each core, one from the US and one from the EU member state. And they've put together what they call the information and action continuum, starting with looking at ontologies and databases, exposure, ecotox testing and modeling, human health modeling, risk assessment, risk management. So at our we just held the 3rd workshop in Washington. Well, now it's almost a half year, but we have a 4th workshop coming up in Venice in March 2015. In the interim, we've asked the co-chairs to give us feedback on what's working, what's not. And surprisingly, they are researchers, so 2 points. They're looking for increased access to funding for joint activities, which we're definitely working on doing that. And then cooperation on standardization and material characterization. And so that, again, it ties in very well with what's happening with the discussions with the US NCL and the plans for an EU NCL. So I'll stop there. I know we're a little bit behind, and take any questions people may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris, for this presentation of the ongoing collaboration. Is there any question to Chris about the EU-US cooperation? Yes, gentleman in the back, please.
In respect to the EU-US scientific and technological cooperation, particularly in the field of nanomedicine, is there an official agreement established since the Horizon 2020 program of the EC has been approved? Is there an official collaboration with the National Science Foundation and with the Department of the National Institute of Health in a number of fields? Are the agreements established between those two so that a real cooperation can take place on scientific and technological matters?
Yeah. I would say there's not, well, so the individual agencies have a number of agreements in place, but in terms of specifically with nanomedicine, there's nothing in place yet. I can say those discussions are ongoing right now. We're also in the process of extending the United States EU, what we call a science and technology agreement, which governs all cooperation under that. And particular issues we're looking at are trying to resolve some of the difficulties that researchers have or institutes have in signing agreements. There can be some legal impediments, and so we're trying to do that. But I would say there is support to do more, so we're working on it.
Any other question? Yes, please, gentlemen.
Thank you for such a nice overview. I have a very practical question. How sophisticated, how advances are in the United States with respect to nanodiagnostics?
Well, in terms of nanodiagnostics, the NNI has set up what we call signature initiatives that focus in targeted areas. And one of the nanotechnology signature initiative is focused on diagnostics and sensors. And so if you go to the nano.gov website, you'll see there's you can find information about that signature initiative, and there's even there's a white paper available there. The NIH, in particular, the NCI is very active in that signature initiative.
Do you think that nano treatment is a priority, or is it comparatively with nanodiagnostics, it's at the same level?
Sorry.
No, I'm just asking what prevails now in the spirit of American scientists. If we have to talk about this nano treatment, cancer treatment using nanoparticles, or we talk also about the nanodiagnostics. Give us the hint.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, both. Yeah, both. The U.S. has the U.S. is a big country, and unfortunately, we have the resources to do both. I don't think we could prioritize.
Thank you.
May I add one additional question? Maybe it's a little bit provocative. I would say the USA is quite ahead of the European Union in terms of not only development, industrial development. So you have, let's say, thanks to the NNI, nearly 15 years ago, you have established a network of infrastructures and so on. And now, as you can see, after many years of investment in basic research, the European Union, under the Horizon 2020 program, is trying to follow the same way. In practical terms, how can we, let's say, speed up the implementation of this translation process in Europe, trying to take advantage of the American experience? How do we have to organize, let's say, these European initiatives and to link them with the American initiatives? What would be your suggestions?
Oh, well, I think you're very kind in saying the U.S. is far ahead of Europe. I think Europe is doing very well with the Horizon 2020 is an impressive document and an impressive increase in resources committed to S&T cooperation. One of the issues, there are some barriers that don't need to be there, and that's some of these these legal issues that periodically universities come to us and say, we would love to work with the Commission, but we've got this this problem, we can't sign this agreement, and also I'm sure there's difficulties with European institutes working with the U.S. So we're trying to make it as easy. We're trying to remove some of those barriers to work with the EU. and then, of course, particularly the U.S., we look to the EU to try to lay the groundwork for responsible, responsible development of nanotechnology. And of course, to try to the extent possible, harmonize our regulatory procedures such that we don't have we don't have trade issues that we've unfortunately developed in other areas of the economy.
Thank you. Oh, yes. One question for Donald first.
Thinking of your last remark, genetically modified food strikes me as an example. How would you avoid the sorts of problems that have arisen there, where to label in the US was presented as being, that means there's something wrong with the food, and to label in the UK means, here's a piece of useful information. And Monsanto completely differing from the UK perspective, and by ignoring it, created the problem, because they didn't take the sensitivity in the UK and therefore but the rest of Europe seriously at that crucial point, even though they were warned, actually dropped the ball for the whole of Europe by accident. I don't think they even realized what they were doing. But, okay, we've learned from these things, but how do we avoid, suppose we did find in some area a stronger sensitivity in Europe compared with America? How do you handle that in future?
Yeah. So, you know, a lot of, I think a lot of what we do in this area is, if we're successful, you'll never see it. I think nanotechnology is an area that we have engaged early with a number of countries. The OECD working parties were set up in 2005, 2006, strong participation from the US and the EU. And of course, we have these regular dialogues where the EU will share information on things they're thinking about, and we have an opportunity to comment. I mean, we're never going to be able to avoid any of these things, but I think we're doing our best to have a dialogue to share our concerns with the EU, and likewise when they have concerns about things that our regulators are thinking about. But yeah.
Yes. One question in the back, and then the last one, the next one.
It is correct what you're saying. There are many agreements between all national countries, Germany, France, and the United States, and the European Union. But what is absolutely vital, that there are joint calls for tenders. That means that in the case of the European Union, jointly with, for example, national science foundations and other bodies, make joint calls in such a way that there is a collaboration, strong collaboration between the scientists of the various countries on a program, what has been decided by both countries. And there should be regularly calls for tenders made in specific fields, particularly in the field of nanomedicine, nano-cancer. And I thought, and that was my first question before, that between the National Cancer Center, the National Institute of Health in Bethesda, together with the Brussels offices, were negotiating such kind of agreements for joint call for tenders. And I think that is the right way to go, so that a number of research institutes from Europe can work in close contact on the same topics in the United States. And I think people like you, and you are very related to the OECD, which is a very good mechanism in addition, would be very useful to promote such kind of initiatives. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Then the gentleman in the back.
Great presentation. I'm going to step out on a limb here, and please correct me if I'm stepping too far out, because I don't want to put any words in your mouth. But I want to go back to you just for a second, going back to the GM issue. And going back to Patrick as well, because I think you both raise a very interesting point just talk about GM for 1 second. The biggest issue is the EU has decided that GM is bad, therefore most of the companies that are doing any genetically modified, any gene trials, they're being done outside of Europe, period, full stop. So no matter what happens between, Yeah, but the majority are outside of the EU. A lot of the large companies I have spoken to, I will not name any of them, all say, we are going to the US to do all of that work. And they are asking the scientists, the few scientists that were trained in genetic engineering, to go to the US to work in some of those facilities. So one of the big issues I think here is it's a difference between consumption for life or the access to have something to extend life, which is a medical issue. And I think, living on both sides of the world, I think if the EU can sort of stomach the possibility of the convergence that we've heard a few minutes ago, of the possibility of doing genetically altered therapeutics with the advent of nanotechnology and nanomedicine, this may open the door to bring some of that back to the EU, since I happen to be at MIT and at Heidelberg both. I find it very interesting between the two, and I think the regulations in the EU are very difficult in some cases in order to start and to progress a company, where in the US a lot of those things have been removed, a lot of those barriers have been removed from tax, from regulation. And I'm not saying that's all good, I'm not saying it's all bad. But this is one of the things I've seen over the past few years actually living here, and on the other side, at the NNI. There is one issue, and I'd like to ask, here's the question. Okay. The one issue is, some of the technology that's developed in the US has export restrictions. You're not allowed to export it back out. And the US, a lot of large companies in the US have also said to me, well, we're not going to do that development in the US because then we can't market it to the rest of the world. So they go to other places. So there's a sort of a double-sided coin here. Each one is doing something a little bit differently. How do you see that changing in the US from the export restrictions for some of the technology, from a medical basis as opposed to a military basis? And that may be an unfair question, yeah, and you can refuse to answer it.
Yeah, well, I guess I would maybe take a diversion on that a bit, and the export controls, they are always under constant revision, and some of the strictest export control revisions we had were on satellite technologies, and they were so strict that they were really hurting U.S. industry. And so there was a review, and actually just this year, they have been relaxed significantly. And surprisingly, the biggest advocate for relaxing those restrictions were the Department of Defense, because they said, we're not going to have an industrial base if we keep these. So, you know, beyond that, I would say that people are looking at that issue, and where warranted, they can be revised.
So now the very last comment. Yes, please.
Yes. First of all, I'm Frank Weichhold. I'm from FDA, and I offer you my personal opinion, not necessarily that what the FDA will decide, but a few thoughts. First of all, it's very important that the initiatives to collaborate and integrate and harmonize are supported, but they also not just need to be supported by common calls for attending meetings, they also need to be supported by finances. And that's a big shortfall that we experience in many areas, nationally and internationally. So we need to speak to our politicians, and we need to pressure them to put resources into the harmonization and the collaboration across the continents. Now, if we impose restrictions or labelings, then of course we have to be mindful, what does it mean for industry, right? And usually If we label things as a GMO, people go crazy because they think it's something really bad. But look at the definition. It's something that, you know, we have done for generations and generations. We've selected food according to specific features. We only have the, you know, the grains that are making the biggest kernels. And if you want, and if you look at it, by definition, it's a GMO, right? If you look at the food problem for the future, I think in 50 years, if we don't change the way we make food, we have nothing to eat, or at least the majority of people will have not enough to eat. So I think there are a few things, and I also believe, and that's one of the reasons that I'm here, that nanomedicine and the collaborations and the harmonizations and the thoughts around and the challenges of nanomedicine are typical for emerging fields in technologies, and I think we can perhaps discuss how nanomedicine can stimulate other areas as well. And as such, I would inspire you to continue the dialogue, but I also would encourage you to think of ways how you can make that specific and concrete. And I don't know if it addresses the question, but I think at least a few thoughts.
Thank you very much for your very useful comments. So now we come to the end of this session. I thank you very much, the speakers, especially the speakers coming from overseas, and all the audience for listening to this, to the entire session. And now we have a half an hour break, and so I wish you a very nice late afternoon. Thank you.